Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Macron calls Putin an aggressor as he corrects President Trump's statement on Europe's financial aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer refers to Putin as a menace as he announces an increase to UK defence spending. It comes as the US sides with Russia at the UN, opposing a resolution that condemned Moscow's actions over the three-year conflict with Ukraine. And the Pope spends another night in hospital as thousands of well-wishers gather together in Rome. To our top story, and Emmanuel Macron has said a peace deal with Russia must not mean a surrender of Ukraine. As he told the world's press, Europe should do more to strengthen defence in the region. Yesterday, the French president became the first European leader to visit President Trump at the White House in his second administration. During the joint press conference where the Russia-Ukraine war was discussed, Macron politely corrected Trump when he claimed Europe had loaned money to Ukraine. Here's a reminder of what he said.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear, we have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia would have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me.
Mr. President,
if they get their money back, we don't, and now we do. But you know, that's only fair.
Let's catch up with our correspondent in Paris, Ross Cullen. Ross, hello to you. So both presidents go back a really long way to Trump's very first administration. There's not a lot of people who would correct him like that. How has it gone down both in Paris and Washington? And remind us of their relationship.
Yeah, good evening, Leigh Ann. You're right. There certainly was a lot of alpha male power play in the meeting at the White House. Some media commentators even calling it the return of the bromance. The two men having one-on-one talks and then holding conversations with the press. And what you were just playing there was the pre-lunch chat with members of the media where President Macron interrupted and corrected the US president. So we don't often see that, but obviously Emmanuel Macron felt comfortable enough and he wanted to call out the US president for the misrepresentation of the composition of European aid packages to Ukraine. They met first in Donald Trump's first term, also Emmanuel Macron's first term, when the French president invited Mr. Trump here to France to take part in the French National Day, Bastille Day, and certainly, undoubtedly, Donald Trump was overawed by the display of French military hardware and patriotic pageantry. And also Donald Trump was one of the guests of honour in December back here in the French capital for the reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral, and the US president mentioned that very fact during that news conference, saying it was an amazing renovation project of a beautiful building. We all feared the worst when the fire began, and he actually said, Donald Trump, he felt Emmanuel Macron hadn't got enough credit for steering through that 5-year renovation project. But yeah, we could see a lot of that power play, the vigorous handshakes, lots of backslapping, touching each other on the elbow, the knee, calling each other by their first names, dear Donald and dear Emmanuel. So it certainly was very theatrical to watch.
Yes, indeed it was. And as you mentioned, those long handshakes. President Macron, however, made his thoughts on Putin very clear. He called him the aggressor in the conflict and said Putin had violated the peace. That's strong words in front of Trump, who's been accused of siding with Russia. Has there been any backlash to this, or do you think Trump's kind of listened?
Yeah, no doubt about Emmanuel Macron's position, which is that Ukraine was invaded by Russia. We saw the tanks rolling over the Ukrainian border into Ukraine. That was the position of the United States until Donald Trump came back into the White House and has changed the narrative, suggesting that Ukraine began the war. Now, this is something that is forcing Europeans to rapidly shift their position as well, to try to recalibrate their responses in terms of the position taken by Washington. But Emmanuel Macron, during that news conference with Donald Trump, did make it very clear that he felt that Russia was the aggressor. Russia started this war. It could end the war today if it felt it could do so. Also, that Russia had violated those previous peace agreements, the so-called Minsk agreements that were signed, and then those collapsed. And we have then seen that lead up during 2014 to 2021, that build up before the full-scale invasion by Russia in 2022. So we did see that very strong position by Emmanuel Macron being taken, especially importantly, Anne, if we see it in the context of the votes in the United Nations last night, where we saw the United States siding with Russia and China and not siding with its traditional allies, the United Kingdom and France, the 5 Security Council permanent members. That is very interesting to see if going forward the position of Washington is going to be more aligned with Beijing and Moscow than with London and Paris.
Ross, you talked about shifting stances earlier, and the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, announced an increase in defence spending. Do you believe this is a direct result of Macron's meeting, or was he preparing to meet Trump himself?
Well, Leigh Ann, I think it's a direct result of what Keir Starmer himself has said that needs to happen. The British Prime Minister has agreed with Donald Trump on the point that Europeans need to pay more for European defence, that European nations need to increase their defence spending. And there is now a realisation in the British government that the time has come, indeed, to try to cut other departments' spending, to free up more cash to be spent on the Army, on the Navy, on the Air Force, on cyber intelligence, on cyber technology and cyber warfare as well. There is a realisation that there is a war going on the European continent, and there needs to be an increase in defence spending by European nations if they're able to match the commitments that they've made diplomatically, especially if we view that, Leigh Ann, in the context of the United Kingdom saying it will be willing to contribute forces inside Ukraine after any peace deal as part of a reassurance force, as a peacekeeping force. And if there is going to be the deployment of British troops, then that is going to have to require increased spending in the United Kingdom. We're going to get a debrief from Keir Starmer on Sunday after his trip to the White House, which is due to take place on Thursday. And we will also get a debrief from Emmanuel Macron tomorrow on Wednesday, when he speaks to EU leaders, summing up what happened behind closed doors during his trip to Washington.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Volunteers attempting to help those impacted by the civil war in Sudan say the suspension of US humanitarian aid has forced almost 80% of emergency food kitchens to close. The conflict between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces has killed tens of thousands of people and forced millions from their homes since April 2023. The Trump administration stopped all US aid last month to determine whether it was serving US interests. The FBI have found the remains of a British man who went missing in Florida over 2 years ago. Alex Hodgson Doherty was on holiday in Jacksonville in September 2022 when he was reported missing by his mother after she was unable to contact him. His remains were on private land near Kingsland, Georgia. The FBI said no criminal charges are expected in the case. Israel is considering imposing new restrictions on Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound ahead of the holy month of Ramadan. It will stop Palestinian prisoners released as part of the hostage exchange deal struck during the ongoing ceasefire in Gaza from entering the Al-Aqsa compound. 3,000 police personnel will also be deployed at checkpoints leading to the mosque. And the Secret Service agent who leapt onto JFK's car during his assassination has died at the age of 93. Clint Hill went on to become a best-selling author and often shared his guilt over Kennedy's assassination. A statement from his publisher said that Hill died at home with his wife at his side. A cause of death was not given. Staying with the Russia-Ukraine war now, as the US sided with Russia at the United Nations in New York last night on the third anniversary of the conflict. The United States voted alongside Russia and other countries, including North Korea and Belarus, opposing a European draft resolution that condemned Moscow's actions and supported Ukraine's territorial rights. The US also voted for a resolution that called for an end to the war, but interestingly did not criticize Russia, highlighting the Trump administration's change of tact. I'm now joined by Ambassador Mikhail Ulyanov, Russia's permanent representative to international organizations in Russia. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Ambassador. There's been a clear shift in the United States' stance on the conflict, which has gone on for over 3 years. When could we see it resolve? And will there ever be peace between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, actually, peace could have been achieved long ago. We never ever refused to conduct peace talks with Kiev. Peace negotiations started immediately after the beginning of special military operation, and during March of 2022, the two sides, Kiev and Moscow, almost reached a peace accord. The draft was based to a large extent to textual suggestions of the Ukrainian side, and Ukraine initialed this draft. Certain fine-tuning was required, but basically the two sides agreed on main points. Unfortunately, after that, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, intervened. He visited Kiev and prohibited Zelensky to sign a peace deal. He insisted on the need to continue war fighting, promised weapons, money, etc. The same with the United States. Recently, Victoria Nuland confessed that Ukrainians consulted with Washington on a draft peace deal, and Washington recommended not to sign it. Regarding Boris Johnson, relevant facts were revealed by the chief Ukrainian negotiator, Mr. Arahamia, who is very close to Zelensky. So a real chance to achieve peace 3 years ago was missed, and it was not the first case of this kind. Your colleague, a journalist, just a few minutes ago said that Russia violated the Minsk agreements. It's a lie. Actually, we engaged in relevant negotiations together with Angela Merkel, President Hollande in 2015, and an agreement was reached, and it was endorsed by the UN Security Council. But it was never implemented by Ukraine, and Western countries were very tolerable to this sabotage. 1 year ago, 1 year and a half, Angela Merkel confessed why it happened. And President Hollande confirmed that her assessment was accurate. For France and Germany, the Minsk agreements were not about peace. They were about buying time for Ukraine to get prepared for a large-scale war. Now, to a large extent due to the change in the US position, we are closer to the beginning of negotiations. We never ever refused to negotiate. The problem is that President Zelensky issued an order or decree prohibiting any peace talks with Russia. So the first step for him is to cancel his own decision. We are ready, and we are ready to negotiate with Ukraine. We are ready to negotiate with European states if necessary. The fact that only two sides, Russia and the United States, were present at the recent talks in Riyadh was very simple. We discussed ways and means to normalize bilateral relations, to normalize the functioning of diplomatic missions, to discuss some economic issues. Ukraine was just one topic on the agenda among many others. And of course, there was no place for Ukraine or European states to be present there. But as soon as negotiations on peace settlement start, Ukraine will be at the negotiating table. President Putin, Minister Lavrov confirmed it a number of times. And this is the difference between our position and the position of our Western opponents and Ukraine. You might remember that for 2 years, Western countries and Ukraine organized numerous meetings on the basis of so-called peace formula of Zelensky. Russia was never invited to such meetings. It was stupid. And we are not going to repeat the same mistake.
But Ambassador,
yeah.
Just excuse me for just interrupting you for a second. You said Russia wasn't invited to those talks, but much of Europe currently feels like you are the aggressor. Emmanuel Macron has said that Russia was the aggressor and that on February the 24th, 2022, you launched the ground invasion on Ukraine. And this is why the likes of European allies rallied around Ukraine, like Boris Johnson, offering weapons and help to the country. Do you see where the Europeans stand on these negotiation talks?
Well, I don't agree with President Macron. He is higher than me. But in fact, Russia was not an aggressor. As one of my Arab colleagues said, you always need to look at the root causes of a conflict. And indeed, this conflict started long before February 24, 2022. It started in 2014 when, with the assistance of Western countries, a coup d'etat took place in Kyiv. And immediately the new government in Ukraine started, in violation of the constitution, started to use Ukrainian army against civilians in Donbass. It lasted for 8 years. And there was no progress in implementing the peace agreements, which could preserve territorial integrity of Ukraine and bring about peace to the territory of Ukraine. It was not our fault.
But other people would argue that in 2024, Putin illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula. That's how it was seen around the world.
Well, you can have your personal view on this subject, but for me, what is most important is the fact that 96% of Crimean population voted at a referendum to rejoin the Russian Federation. I remember that there were slogans at streets, back home to Russia, etc. And I believe no one would argue that it was the will of the local population. It was not annexation. It was a referendum, which was caused by the violation of human rights of Russian minority by the new Ukrainian authorities after the coup d'etat in 2014. People simply defended themselves, their families, their rights as human beings. It was not an aggression. And, I can speak on this topic very long. Unfortunately, the format of this interview does not allow me to do that. But I could present a great number of facts. For 8 years, people in Donbass were killed by the Ukrainian army. More than 10,000 people 150 children in Donetsk. The youngest of them was 2 months old. It could not last forever. And since there was continued shelling of civilians on the one hand, and sabotage in what regards implementation of the peace Minsk agreement, there was the only way ahead for us to intervene militarily. But it was not an unprovoked, so-called unprovoked invasion. It was provoked for a long time.
Ambassador, I just want to ask you about Dmitry Peskov. He said Russia has a lot of rare earth metals that the US needs, responding to a similar ongoing deal between Zelensky and Trump. Does Russia actually have these to trade, or is this basically power play?
Well, this topic doesn't fall within my competence, and it is of no interest for me as a diplomat. You heard what Peskov said, you heard what President Putin said. I fully trust the assessment, and yes, President Putin offered a possibility of economic cooperation between Russia and the United States in what regards rare metals. Why not, if it mutually beneficial. But for me, the main point is that we need to conduct peace negotiations. We don't need a ceasefire, because we know from the previous experience that when we were naive and admitted that cessation of activities could bring lasting peace, we were, our partners behaved in a wrong manner. So Minister Lavrov yesterday said that combat operations will continue until the relevant durable results in the peace process are achieved.
Ambassador Mikhail of Russia's
we need lasting peace.
Permanent representative to the international organizations in Russia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's get into this further with Norman T. Roule, former senior US intelligence officer from Washington. Norman, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me. We asked our last guest about the United States' change of position on the war. What's the reason for the shift, and who does it look to serve by changing sides?
Good evening. Well, you received a long-winded dose of Russian propaganda, and that gives you a sense of what the world is enduring and what the Ukrainian people endure. The United States government does recognize certain historical realities. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Russia invaded Ukraine again in this most recent war. Russia is occupying territory, and the 2022 agreement that Ambassador Ulyanov lied about requires not only that Ukraine give up that territory, adopt Russian as an official language, reduce its army to 50,000 personnel, and a number of other requirements that no country would accept. The United States is not telling the Ukrainians to fight, but the United States is significantly aiding the Ukrainians in their fight. The position of the U.S. government, however, under the new administration is that 3 years of war have not brought this conflict to the end, that the Russians themselves, having lost hundreds of thousands of men, showing their military to be a third world military that relies upon North Korea and Russian weaponry to survive, has been able to continue this conflict. Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of men. This does not appear to be a conflict which is moving to a conclusion. And the Trump administration's position is it's unwise to spend more time speaking about who started this, who is a dictator, who is responsible, because that rhetoric, even if it's true history, does not get us closer to calling this conflict to an end and saving lives and allowing us to move on. And so the Trump administration is moving to a diplomacy which in essence allows this conflict to be brought to a conclusion to save lives. This is very controversial in the United States and will be controversial in Ukraine because Russia is an aggressor, and there will be strong doubts that Russia will build up in the future to continue aggression at some other time. But the administration is seeking an end to the conflict to save lives and to rebuild the economy of Ukraine to give the country a different future.
Norman, you did hear my conversation before with the ambassador Ulyanov, and he was saying that they want peace talks, but long-lasting peace talks, not just a ceasefire. Do you believe that this is what Russia really wants and is working towards?
Well, Russia, like Iran, always wants peace talks, and he's correct, long peace talks as well. Long peace talks gives them a seat at the table with a great power. Long peace talks gives them a chance to erode and wear down their adversaries. But again, your viewers should just ask themselves, if Russia invaded, took 20% of their country, wanted to change their national language, et cetera, are those reasonable positions? The United States is saying it's going to be up to the Ukrainians to decide their future. But the United States is unwilling, under the Trump administration, to show the same enthusiasm for aid. So Russia will come to the table. And I think what is important is, even with the Trump administration's significant outreach and different attitude towards this conflict, there's no sign that Russia is going to adopt a conciliatory attitude. In fact, the ambassador alluded to long talks. That means more demands. So we may want to look past the rhetoric and the diplomacy of the moment and really focus on, when talks begin, what are Russia's actual demands? And this is for the Ukrainians to accept. But in the end of the day, your viewers have to say, would they accept this from an adversary country that has taken their territory?
Yesterday, the UK announced sanctions on Russia. Today is all about bolstering defence spending itself. Do you believe there is a significant fear from the UK and also from Europe that they'll be left exposed if they lose the support of the US?
Well, certainly, but the administration, the Trump administration's position is they've had 3 years to develop this plan. They've had 3 years to reset their military industrial base to adopt this position. But there are reports that the British military, the British Army, is smaller than at any time since the 18th century. That the Canadian Navy is smaller than the Navy of Iraq and Uruguay. So the Trump administration's position is that Europe talks about increasing aid, talks about improving military action, but does not achieve that. I think we need to look at President Macron's meeting in Europe, where he pulled together a number of European actors to determine what they would do to take the place of the U.S. and to move into Ukraine to provide it with security. It is notable and unfortunate from Washington's perspective that there remains a considerable lack of unity in Europe on something that so many European governments claim to be an existential threat to their own world. If it's existential to them, why is it that the United States must bear so much of the burden for paying and providing weaponry? That's the Trump position's view.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, the problem in Europe is there doesn't seem to be any unity when it comes to this. But I just wanted to ask you, Macron has called Putin the aggressor. Starmer actually called Russia a complete menace today, in many words, a menace in the seas and on land. Do you agree with this? And are they doing the right thing?
Well, again, history is history. Vladimir Putin is an aggressor. He authorized with his military to invade another country in violation of multiple international commitments. That's a historical fact. But dwelling on that and asking that question does not resolve this war. But there's another aspect here. Europe and parts of the American polity say that the initial negotiations between Russia and the United States to establish communications in Riyadh should not have taken place without Europe and Ukraine, because their security interests were at stake. At the same time, Europe had no problem in dealing with the United States with Iran without communicating to the Gulf Cooperation Council in Israel. Further, the same Europe that says do not speak to Vladimir Putin, who, because he is a bloody dictator, which is correct, they have no problems in saying the United States and Europe should deal with the supreme leader of Iran, who is a bloody dictator. So within Washington, there's a sense of dissonance on Europe's policies that seems to be they pick and choose the dictators of their choice and pick and choose the victims they will leave behind.
Norman T. Roule, former senior U.S. intelligence officer from Washington, thank you so much for your insights this evening.
Thank you.
To Rome now, where Pope Francis met with Vatican officials in hospital day today after showing a slight improvement and also sleeping well. The pontiff, who is battling pneumonia in both lungs, remains under medical supervision after being admitted with breathing difficulties and bronchitis. Hundreds of well-wishers have left candles outside Gemelli Hospital, whilst others have gathered in St. Peter's Square as they recite prayers for the 88-year-old. We can now go live to Rome to speak to the Vatican expert, Philip Pullella. Philip, so nice to have you on the show this evening. The Pope was well enough to do some work from the hospital today after showing a slight improvement in his health. Sources close to the Vatican reportedly say he's eating and moving about in his hospital room. How's he doing?
Yeah, that's pretty much correct. I mean, we shouldn't read too much into it. He's doing work. What do we mean by that? I mean, paperwork. Like anybody who's been in a hospital, there's an armchair in his bedroom. He's got a suite there, which is reserved for popes. So what they mean by that is that he's getting out of bed. He's not bedridden, sitting down. He's still on oxygen. He's giving some documents to sign or to approve of. And that is the extent of it. He is eating normally. He's not being fed intravenously. So, as you said, the latest signs are good. However, he is still in critical condition. The prognosis is still guarded in the sense that they still don't know how long he's going to be have to stay in the hospital. The latest this morning was that he had that he rested all night. And so that's good. The latest medical bulletin should be coming out just in a matter of minutes, perhaps even when we're on the air. So we'll see, which will give us the latest details. And that's basically the situation. Another thing that came out last night is that he did have some kidney problems in the sense that the slight amount of kidney failure, that is, his kidneys are not working as well as they should be. But the positive thing about last night was that the doctors say that they have that under control. It's a very, very complex situation with different kinds of microbes and viruses, et cetera, that are being attacked, fought against with various types of medicine. The timing is important, the number, the amount of cortisone, all these kinds of things that make it a very, very complex situation, particularly for someone who is 88 years old.
There appears to be some speculation around that he might actually resign. How likely is this, and what will happen if this does happen?
Well, I think it's under the present circumstances. I think it's highly unlikely, extremely unlikely. He has said several times that he would be willing to resign if he was totally incapacitated and thus unable to run the church. Now, what totally incapacitated means can be interpreted. What I interpret it as being sort of like being in a coma, having had a stroke or something like that. As we said earlier, he's sitting up in his hospital armchair and being able to sign documents. He's able to talk to aides. He's communicating with the doctors and the nurses who are treating him. They say he's vigilant, etc. That is as of last night's bulletin. There's a precedent, obviously, for a pope resigning. That was Pope Benedict, who resigned in February of 2013, allowing for the election of Francis. Now, at the beginning, Francis, while former Pope Benedict was alive, Francis continued referring to him as a grandfather in the house and that kind of stuff there. But after Benedict died, Pope Francis changed his tune somewhat and said that before he was saying that, a Pope Emeritus is something that we should get used to, but afterwards, excuse me, he said that it should not become a normal thing. And indeed, the 10-year period in which there were two men who were both wearing white inside the Vatican while former Pope Benedict was still alive caused a lot of confusion among the faithful. It added to a polarization of the church. And I don't think that Francis wants that to happen again.
Philip, we know that he's got a great sense of humour from everything I read, and he's been sent all these get well wishes from around the world. Even the stars of the Vatican thriller Conclave wish him well at the SAG Awards on Sunday. Will this mean a lot to the Pope?
Well, I'm not so sure he's going to be made aware of that, the thing about the stars of Conclave, unless one of the aides tells him. But I don't think there's a TV in the room. I'm sure that he would have a good time with that. I think that he would probably be quite amused by it. I don't think that he's seen the film yet. But there's been a lot of the children in particular. The 10th floor of the Gemelli Hospital, which has this section of it which is reserved for use only by popes. It adjoins another area which is used by other people, but it also adjoins a children's cancer ward. So the children in the next ward on the other side of the wall, so to speak, have been sending him a lot of get well cards, and some of them are very cute, sort of like stick man images of someone who is dressed in white, saying in Italian, mostly in Italian, get well soon and we love you and that kind of stuff there. They have brought some of these over to the Vatican press room to show journalists, and they're actually quite cute. And I'm sure that he is moved by that. He has also said that he is grateful for people who are wishing him well and praying for him. You're right. He does have a sense of humor. As his various ailments progressed over the past couple of years, he's become less mobile, had trouble with the knee. Every time someone would ask him how he was, I interviewed him twice, had a sit down with him twice. The last time I interviewed him in 2022, when I greeted him when he came into the room where we had set up, I said, "How are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm alive, as you see." So he does have a kind of sense of humor about his own health. He did say one time, I can't remember whether it was on the plane when we were traveling somewhere, or in another circumstance, where he said that he doesn't like pain. And he said that when he dies, he hopes it be very quick and not a painful death. Obviously, when you are feeling like you don't have any oxygen, you can't breathe, that's not very pleasant, but we'll hope for the best and see what tonight's medical bulletin says.
Philip Pullella, the Vatican expert. All I just want to say is it's always good to be alive. Thank you so much for joining me.
That's so true. Thank you.
A reminder of our top stories. Macron calls Putin an aggressor as he corrects President Trump's statement on Europe's financial aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer refers to Putin as a menace as he announces an increase to UK defence spending. It comes as the US sides with Russia at the UN opposing a resolution that condemned Moscow's actions over the 3-year conflict with Ukraine. And the Pope spends another night in hospital as thousands of well-wishers gather together in Rome. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. The Dressing Room is coming up next, and don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with G&T. Good night, and thank you for joining us.